Welcome to the Self-Sufficiency channel with Johnny Lee. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe if you find this content valuable to your life. You know, most people believe that they are thinking, but they're not. They are recalling, they are repeating, and they are defending. And that distinction matters more than people realize, because when you're repeating something you were taught, you don't feel like you're repeating it. You feel like it's yours. But that's what makes it dangerous. I want you to think about how beliefs actually form. Nobody wakes up one day and says, I'm going to examine every possible worldview and choose the one that holds up. That's not what happens. You're born into a system, a family, a culture, a religion, a language, a set of assumptions. And before you're even capable of questioning anything, you're already absorbing everything. So by the time you're old enough to think for yourself, you're not starting from zero, you're starting from a script. And that script feels natural, it feels normal, it feels true. But again, familiarity is not truth. It's repetition. And this is where people get uncomfortable. Because once you realize that, you have to ask yourself a question most people avoid. How much of what I believe did I actually choose? Not inherit, not absorb, not repeat, but choose. Because choosing requires something different. It requires stepping outside of what you were taught and looking at it from the outside. And most people never do that. Not because they're incapable, but because they were never trained to. You were trained to accept. You were trained to trust. You were trained to believe. But you were not trained to evaluate. And you can see it in real time. Just ask someone what they believe, and they'll tell you. Ask them why they believe it, and you'll get emotion. You'll get stories. You'll get repetition. But very rarely will you get a process, a way of thinking, a method of arriving at truth. Because for most people, truth is not something they have discovered. It's something that they were given. And once something is given to you early enough, you don't question it. You protect it, even if it doesn't hold up, even if it contradicts reality, even if it requires you to ignore evidence, because now it's not just a belief, it's a part of your identity, and people will defend their identity even when it's wrong. That's why thinking is so rare, because real thinking does something uncomfortable. It forces you to say, this might not be true. Not, I don't like this. Not, this makes me uncomfortable. But this might not actually be real. And once you open that door, you can't go back to blind certainty. Because now every belief has to pass a test. And it's not, was I taught this? But rather, does this hold up? And that is the shift most people never make. They move through life with confidence, but without examination. And confidence without examination is just reinforced ignorance. Let me say that again. Confidence without examination is reinforced ignorance. Because the more you repeat something, the more certain you feel. Not because it's true, but because it's familiar. And familiarity creates the illusion of truth. That is why people will argue passionately about things that they've never actually investigated. That's why they'll defend beliefs they couldn't explain under pressure. That's why they'll reject questions instead of answering them. Because questioning doesn't just challenge the idea, it challenges the foundation they've been standing on. And most people would rather protect the foundation than rebuild it. But the self-sufficient individual makes a different decision. He or she doesn't ask, what was I taught? but he or she asks, what can I prove? They do not protect ideas. They test them. They don't avoid discomfort, but they use it. And that leads to something most people don't want but desperately need: accuracy. Because truth is not about comfort. It's about alignment with reality. And reality does not care what you were taught. It doesn't adjust to your beliefs. It doesn't bend to your feelings. It just is. And if your beliefs don't match reality, you don't get a pass. You get consequences. That's why this matters. Because this isn't philosophical. This is practical. If you don't know how to think, you can be led. And if you can be led, you can be controlled. And if you can be controlled, you're not free. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the chain. And it starts with something simple: not knowing how to think. So here's the self-sufficiency answer to this. You cannot build your life on beliefs you have never tested. You cannot move through reality repeating ideas you've never examined. You cannot claim truth without a process for finding it. And that process requires something most people avoid: facing reality as it is, not as you wish it to be. That is what I call truth over escapism. Not hiding in belief, not protecting comfort, but choosing reality even when it costs you certainty. Because once you learn how to think, you don't need to be told what to believe. You can figure it out. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where real independence begins. Remember, as I always say, life is suffering, death is mercy. No one is coming to save you. So save yourself. Until next time.